oportunidad muy importante para consolidar la ecología.
Illető országok minisztériumainak, kormányainak, tudományos
biodiversity sa pinakamataas sa buong mundo.
연구에 대해서 논의를 하고 회의를 하고 있는데
Understanding the environment requires an appreciation for the complexity, variability, and dynamics of nature's ecosystems. The Long-Term Ecological Research Program, LTER, has been formed in over 24 countries to begin meeting that need.
Policymakers and resource managers need to make decisions. Often they only have short-term or very site-specific data for those decisions. There is high potential for risk and uncertainty if they only have that type of information. We need a holistic, long-term approach that addresses larger spatial scales of analysis, longer temporal studies that reflect our dynamic environment, comparative research performed at many sites, and systematic data collection and management for future use.
We must go beyond traditional ecological research to include urban environments and promote interdisciplinary research.
In Korea, about 46% of the people are living in urban areas. So urban area represent air pollution, water pollution, and high density of people and many uses of the resources. People nowadays feel it very strongly that environment is deteriorating. So there comes the very strong need to study urban site.
LTER programs put together teams of scientists to develop interdisciplinary research. We need to encourage a new way of thinking among our scientists, a new way of expanding their research. This shift may be one of the most important contributions of the LTER strategy to modern science.
When you're studying ecology in the city, it relates to engineering because you're dealing with built environment, it deals with architecture because you're dealing with planning, you deal with chemists, hydrologists, civil engineers, and social scientists.
LTER programs also emphasize collecting, labeling, and archiving the data to preserve the work for future managers, scientists, and students.
In the 80s, we were trying to address the acid rain question. It was the availability of a 20-year data set from Hubbard Brook on lake chemistry that showed that, in fact, there had been acid rain. We were able to say it quite unequivocally that there had been a reduction in the pH of the rainfall, an increase in the acidity of the rainfall. And it's that kind of long-term data set that allows us to make much more effective policy decisions.
The challenge is the commitment, I think. The commitment from government and the passions from scientists. That's a challenge because for long-term project, you need long-term commitment.
Decades from now, with new tools and analyses, we can re-examine our knowledge base and even these specimens to discover new information.
Science is often applied to problems which we didn't realize existed 10 or 20 years ago. So basic science, one of the functions of basic science is to uncover the problems, which we can then use that basic science to try and address.
The International LTER program began following a 1993 conference organized by the U.S. office of the LTER network. Scientists from around the world attended. Annual meetings have been held ever since. By the year 2002, there were networks of sites in 25 countries, linking over 200 sites and several thousand scientists from university, private, and government research institutions. Many more countries are in the process of developing LTER networks.
As the global international LTER network grows, everyone who participates will benefit. You will get better and better information for natural resource management in your country, and the network will facilitate scientific cooperation around important environmental issues.
LTER programs examine environmental questions with worldwide implications. For example, the role of climate change and natural disturbances on natural and managed ecosystems. the extent of desertification and its causes, the restoration of degraded soils, water pollution, preservation of biodiversity, and impacts of humans.
We understand a lot about the local pollution problems, but there's another dimension to this. Pollution sources here have their impact maybe hundreds or even thousands of miles away because of the transport and the atmosphere, in the rivers, in the oceans. And then it may well move through the food chains and eventually coming out through to human beings. So that long-term transport is a critical element. We've got to understand the dynamics of how it gets there and how it moves through the system. The long-term sites that we have networked along transects and gradients provide some of the key elements to help us address those questions.
International collaborative efforts will facilitate studies of many large-scale phenomena.
I'm working on the typhoon disturbance in Taiwan, and I know there are some researchers in Puerto Rico, and they are doing similar studies. People used to do things at their own location and assuming it's the same worldwide, but which may not be true, and we never know unless we compare our study at different locations around the world.
From small 1-meter plots to regional scales, these models map important regional conditions such as grain yield and loss of soil organic matter from a century of agricultural practices.
South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique. In fact, we share the same problems. We share the same rainfall pattern, we share the same wind, the same, the vegetation very similar. And really we cannot solve the problems ourselves as a country, but as a region.
Training and education of future scientists is another specific goal of LTER programs. Scientists can bring research opportunities to students. For graduate students, research exchanges provide educational opportunities that return new expertise to their native countries.
Our research has found that native grasses restore the soil after it is depleted by crops like cotton. If farmers will allow the grass to take over a field, it will be ready to grow crops in 2 to 3 years.
Western Europe know more about biodegradation, and for this reason I coming here, because we can't be isolated in our country. This problem is really international problem.
As an LTER member, you will have access to new techniques and new technologies.
Science development has been historically something that has been achieved through the collaboration with international institutions. So the international interaction will allow us to get some technical knowledge and techniques that are not available in the country by accessing that technology through the International Long-Term Ecological Research Network.
Policy needs a science base. We have to improve how research gets translated for policymakers.
It's not sufficient for us to acquire new knowledge and to share it with each other. More and more scientists are beginning to appreciate the importance of communicating the results of their scientific inquiries to the public and to policymakers. Not only do we have to share this knowledge, but we have to do so in a way that is meaningful to those individuals.
This story from San Juan is a good example.
One of the best examples that I know of LTER science being used directly to solve a local environmental problem has to do with this water intake. In 1994, the local water authority had to increase the amount of water for this particular area. The initial plan was to actually make a small dam here to take out water to send to the water treatment plant. This stream, the Rio Maimeas, is the last stream in Puerto Rico, and as far as we can tell, the Caribbean, that drains the whole elevation sequence from the cloud forest to the coast without any major dam, without any major water intake, without any major pollution sources. But the local community got concerned. The fishermen at the mouth of the river got concerned because they were afraid about their fishing community. The kayakers that use the lower river were afraid about changes in the stream flow and the increase in sewage effluent that would be going in and the bathing conditions. The Forest Service was concerned because of the impact it would have on the forest, and particularly on the species that migrate back and forth.
Scientists had long-term information on stream flow and drought frequency. They had decades of information on ecological requirements of the shrimp population and other organisms that live there. They also had a good idea of how much water was actually in the stream. Removing 5 million gallons per day and leaving 5 million could preserve the river ecosystem. Instead of a dam, the solution became intake pipes. Water flowed underground into pumps on the bank and then on for usage. Further research contributes to system management, reducing damage to migrating shrimp larvae.
There's always going to be competing needs for resources, water supply, for recreation, for biodiversity. Scientists working together with managers and the public in a long-term manner can develop ways to manage the system for the long-term benefit for this generation and for future generations.
Environmental concerns often have links to public health. In the U.S., in New Mexico, LTER scientists established links between rodent populations and the 1993 outbreak of the deadly hantavirus in humans.
Prior to '93, Bob and I had been doing small mammal monitoring on the Sevieta for other reasons, for ecological reasons. And it was those data that showed us that what the rodent populations did under different climatic regimes that allowed us to very quickly come up with this hypothesis. Because the data were archived properly and because they were accessible, we were able to use those data to address a totally different problem than what they were originally collected for.
Long-term ecological research helps predict the ecology of human diseases. It's possible to monitor environmental factors and correlate them to incidents of human disease. If we understand what causes them and what transmits them, we can develop strategies to prevent diseases in the first place.
Public health officials could use such a model to be able to predict, perhaps months or years ahead of time, specifically where, or what geographic point, what specific habitat type, and when, what year, what season, risk of disease to human populations is going to be higher. And then they can take appropriate intervention measures.
Now let's see how some members organized their programs. The United States, Brazil, and China adopted a competitive scientific review of proposals submitted to a funding agency. In the U.S., that agency is the National Science Foundation. In Brazil, it's the National Research Council.
Well, the reserve, this site here, was first set in the mid-70s as an area for natural reserve. Cerrado. And 2 years ago, Brazil started its own program of sites for long-term ecological research, and it was on a competitive base. And then they started the program and presented a project. We have scientists and students from Argentina, from Venezuela, from Colombia, from the U.S. Several joint projects have been developed here and being financed both by Brazilian sources and international sources.
China selected their sites through their National Academy of Sciences. China also took an innovative approach to funding. Beginning in 1988, a loan package from the World Bank provided funds for the China Environmental Protection Agency and initial funding for the startup of the Chinese LTER called CERN.
Long-term goal of Chinese Ecosystem Research Network is through field observation with remote sensing and models and another approach to understand the ecosystem changes, then find a suitable approach for sustainable use.
Under this long-term goal, they set 5 tasks. The first one is monitoring. Second, research. Evaluating research projects dealing with structure, function, dynamics, and management of different ecosystems. Third, setting up demonstration sites to show local people and local governments sustainable management of natural resources. Fourth, join the decision-making process, using research results to influence environmental decisions. Finally, every station has their own very specific regional problems, but they also make contributions to continental and global issues, sharing data to try to understand global environmental problems.